and critique of historical media. And then our final presentation of this section is by Laura Littlefair, who will be looking at From Cradle to the Grave, Recontextualising the Deindustrialised Railway Town. She is a researcher and emerging museum professional and currently doing a PhD in History and Museum Studies at Northumbria University in collaboration with the National Railway Museum and Locomotion. Her current research centres around deindustrialised communities that intersect with heritage institutions and how local voices are intrinsic to its history, heritage and collective memory. So each presentation will be about 15 minutes, and then there'll be about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So everyone wants to welcome Hope.
Hello, so my presentation is on accessing interpretation, and it's about disability history, and it's also kind of a reflection on my work placement that I did at the National Railway Museum. So I'm also bringing in a lot of the lessons that I learned while working there. So, founded in 1975, the National Railway Museum in New York was established to ignite visitors' curiosity about people, places, and engineering marvels behind the railways through their collections. Their exhibitions help to celebrate the past, present, and future of innovation on the railway. And in addition to telling the history of the railways as part of their wider mission, they wish to inspire all generations and tailor opportunities they offer accordingly. So my placement with them earlier this year focused on curatorial and exhibition roles, which culminated in an exhibition proposal I designed alongside two other classmates. The exhibition was to reflect the values and themes of the NRM and needed to reflect their current redevelopment project called Vision 2025, which is seeking to share stories not yet told and give voice to the countless men and women who lived, worked, and traveled on the railways. These factors prompted our team to explore telling some of the railway's hidden histories, a term described by Jennifer Hunt as referring to stories which have been described as contested, silenced, or difficult histories. So, if you don't mind going to the next slide, thank you. The hidden histories our exhibition examined were birthed out of a complex process exploring the roles that museums play as tools of social justice. My discussion today is focused on the topics we were primarily researching and the factors which shaped our decision-making process and overall exhibition design. This will be done first by explaining the ways museums are vital instruments for change. From here, I will expand into a discussion of our initial choice of disability and the tools that are vital for representing communities that you as a practitioner might not be a part of, as everyone on our team was able-bodied. And from there, I will expand into a discussion, I will also discuss core themes which are needed to be implemented when talking about disability, so it's done ethically and respectfully. Finally, I will commence by touching on accessibility and important features which should be considered by practitioners when designing their exhibits, regardless if it's about disability or not. Our investigation into disability history informed the way we designed our exhibit, but we ultimately didn't focus on it in our exhibit, but I'll talk a little bit about why we chose not to later, but it was still a part of it. And moreover, all visitors should have the ability to learn and engage with exhibits, see themselves reflected in exhibits, and this begins with looking at hidden histories and accessibility. So if you don't mind, thank you. So in providing us a background to comprehend our placement's principles, our supervisor informed and guided our discussions by highlighting the key values and mission of the Railway Museum, which I previously discussed. We considered our topic choice seriously and wanted something that would tell lesser known histories, straying away from more prominent narratives, such as those of the royals whose tales occupy Station Hall. We wanted to focus on everyday people whose experiences were interpreted. What's more, we also wanted our topic to discuss important social issues. So in the last several decades, museums have established themselves as platforms for discussing and raising awareness for social issues. Jocelyn Dodd, Sarah Jones, Debbie Jolly, and Richard Sandel argued that museums have begun, quote, developing and displaying and exhibitions that offer more respectful and equitable ways of representing different communities, many of which have, until more recently, been omitted from or marginalized within museum narratives. This attitude has been manifested in the NRM's push towards expanding the scope of their stories that they tell. Therefore, we wanted our exhibit to stimulate these discussions surrounding sensitive and often avoided topics to help advance the museum's mission. And by confronting social issues, we hope to design an exhibition to inspire and challenge people based on the principle that museums are perceived as institutions of authority. Dodd et al. Communicated this sense of authority in their paper, stating that museums have been seen as places of authority with the capacity to offer credible ways about talking and thinking about a topic. Furthermore, in a study in 2018 by Wilkening Consulting found that 81% of Americans find museums and heritage sites to be trustworthy institutions, and the Museums Association in 2021 reported that 86% of Britons say they trust museum curators. Museums place issues in historical context, which, as Robert Sandel explains, can counter prejudice by reframing, informing, and enabling society's conversations about difference. By addressing popular topics and exploring history, museums can inform people about the history of topical issues, and through questions and exhibits, they can leave a lasting impact by encouraging visitors to think critically. Next slide. Thank you. So, contributing to our desire to discuss popular issues, the initial topic we gravitated towards was discussing life on the railway for people with disabilities, as the NRM has a collection of prosthetics belonging to railway workers, and the stories these objects tell of working on the railway with disability. We were really inspired by the burgeoning desire in museums to discuss hidden histories, as in the last 20 years, depictions of disabilities in museums have increased as institutions have begun revisiting past interpretations, which often perpetuated offensive and harmful depictions of disability. This then has resulted in a wealth of studies looking into modifying these methods and practices surrounding it. Throughout our project, we studied these methods and ultimately concluded that we didn't have the time or resources to properly address it in full, but we did, as I said, incorporate the stories into the main exhibit, and nevertheless, coming to this conclusion was very informative, and there are really important principles which I'd like to touch on. The first major takeaway from our research about how to interpret hidden histories was the need for tackling the future of the issue, not just dwelling on the past. Museums which have garnered success through issues inspiring people to take action towards social justice issues were ones which posed questions and probed people to consider the future. It was therefore our intention to use this exhibit to talk about the history of disability on the railways, demonstrating what has changed, followed by a challenge to visitors showing them how these changes need to continue. While society has developed their acceptance of disability in many regards, the railways are sorely lacking. In 2017, The Guardian reported that nearly 80% of stations in the UK are not accessible to deaf, disabled, and older people, and at the current rate, it would be over 200 years before all rail networks are accessible. This data demonstrates that the relationship between disability and the railways still has a way to go, and thus our exhibits wanted to challenge people to consider how this would be improved. And instead of focusing on people's inability to utilize the railways, we wanted to ask, how can we work to enable greater access? Exhibits must acknowledge and explore the past, but particularly with topical issues, there's an opportunity to encourage audiences to think critically about what they can do to help the issue and what they can do to improve situations. The next step was to diverge away from negative stereotypes from the past that are regressive, and this is by challenging tropes and reframing the narrative through the social model of disability. Do you mind going to the next? Oh wait, no, I'm on the right one, sorry. The Research Center for Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester conducted a study in 2007 to 2008 to target best practices for interpreting disability history. The study concluded that the most respectful way to look at the story of disability is that with the social model, which works to challenge and reconfigure such negative representations by highlighting the environmental, attitudinal, and social barriers that disabled people face in struggles for equality and basic human rights. In this way, it is trying to understand that the world isn't adapted for people with disabilities, as opposed to saying that people with disabilities aren't made for the regular world, trying to change that standard. This view places the responsibility for the struggles that people with disabilities face not on them, but on society who resists change to be more inclusive, emphasizing that the direction forward is with greater accessibility. By examining disability history with this perspective, it also frames people with disabilities not as the problem or the victim. Instead, it shifts the view that people with disabilities are first and people first, and disability is something that they have to navigate with in life. It equalizes people by recognizing them as humans. Utilizing the social model to explain disabilities helps museums explain how the world is designed to impair people, but this is why they have been looked on as less than, but nevertheless, despite popular views throughout history, they're still equal. This also allows people to see these as identities separate from their impairments. Amanda Robledo Sanchez Guerrero elaborates on this, describing that focusing on a person's disability as their identity takes the personal and social identity of people and reduces it to their uniqueness, relegating it to the background and the rest of their values as individuals. The social model of disability disavows this habit by differentiating the individual from the disability, and it becomes powerful as it guides the interpretation to focus back on the stories of who the people are first and foremost, and disability is merely a factor in the bigger picture of their life. Could you go to the next slide? In addition to our research about approaching disability history, we were encouraged to speak with Amy Thrace-Connor, the Curating for Change Fellow looking into disability-related stories. She herself has a disability, and so our supervisor recommended that we meet with her to discuss our topic. It was really helpful to get feedback from someone as part of the community whose history we're seeking to interpret, and we benefited from her comments. As someone who is also investigating disabled histories at the museum, she applauded our initiative and affirmed our focus on the social model, but suggested larger discussions with a focus group comprised of members of the disability community. As Ross Edelstein has stated, people with disabilities are able to advocate for themselves no matter their needs, and they should thus be included in discussions about representing their community. Disability, as Anna Caraballo points out, is a spectrum with various layers and levels which cannot be combined into a homogeneous group, meaning it presents itself in a multitude and diversity of situations and different levels that consequently require specific needs. Therefore, to avoid generalizing experiences and identities, it's necessary to consult with a breadth of people with various physical and mental impairments to better comprehend and interpret the scope. This has been further evidenced by the Research Center for Museum and Gallery Study on improving practices of designing exhibitions about disability. The Rethinking Disability Representation Project relied on think tanks which were, quote, comprised of disabled activists, artists, and cultural practitioners. They also played a key role in the process of guiding and supporting museums in their experimental practice, and were there to offer constructive criticism, knowledge, and advice. The employment of these practices were seen as vital because it allowed these museums to work intimately with disabled activists so they could achieve a product which would be beneficial to these marginalized groups and help them to better advocate for their causes. And because this was seen as so instrumental, developing an exhibit centered around conversations about disability required the voices of the community's input. Unfortunately, with the time that we had on our placement, we couldn't conduct discussions and studies about what the community's vision would look like, and so it wasn't part of our main focus, but we still included these individual stories. Nevertheless, these are important takeaways and guidelines, as just because you are not part of the community or group does not mean you should neglect to tell their history. Instead, as practitioners in museums, you have the power to understand the past, but to do so, it needs to be with the consultation and collaboration of members of that community, and not through your own interpretation. It's really important to listen to people's voices. The next slide. And so the last component of the project I'd like to speak on is designing accessible exhibits. While we didn't end up framing our exhibition on the topic of disability, one thing we discussed while designing the disability exhibition was the necessity about having accessible spaces. Accessibility was still a necessary value for the design because museums and culture should be accessible for people in all walks of life. Everybody should be able to engage and access history. As part of our design for the exhibit, we began by emphasizing, firstly, physical passageways that would accommodate for people with physical impairments, and that they should be at least 150 to 200 centimeters, which would allow mobility aids ample space to maneuver. Panels and objects are intended to be placed with between 4 and 5 feet, which is also optimal level for people who are situated at all heights. For people with disability impairments, we chose contrasted colors, which would contrast brightly for people with color blindness, so they could see and understand the exhibit and not be confused or unable to understand what we were writing on our panels. And just below you can see an image of what the different types of contrast, how it's important, even with color design, if you're going to have 2 different colors with wording on them. And we wanted to also have them at specific levels so people of all heights could reach them, and to accommodate for visitors who are neurodivergent and struggle with crowded or overstimulating rooms. We proposed advertising quiet hours, which they could come to visit in. And another thing I put up there is, which I actually learned last night after having a conversation with somebody who is a clinical researcher, is considering allowing options for all levels of stimulation, which is important if you have somebody that does enjoy to be overstimulated and that's something they're looking for in an exhibit, allowing people to choose what level they'd like to experience it. So that can be accomplished with audio guides or different soundscapes. One of the features of our design for the exhibit had soundscapes where you could hear the sounds when you went underneath these little sound showers. And by doing that, that allows somebody to go and listen to the stories that we were going to have being played in the different oral histories, but also it doesn't create this calamitous sound that's going on with so many different sounds going on. And then the last slide. Yeah. So providing this information and making everything easily accessible to people right from the get-go when you design your exhibits is inherently important because it allows people to work with the social model of disability. If we're designing exhibits from the get-go so that everyone can experience them, it's not allowing people to come into the exhibit feeling as if they're othered or that they have to ask for special modifications if we design it with these modifications in mind. This project was an informative journey which expanded my understanding of accessibility and interpretation. And it is very important for practitioners to interpret stories in the best and most respectful ways as possible, as they're vital to our society and need to be told. If you yourself want to address histories of communities you're not a part of, embrace them, but do so in an informed manner, and take time to talk to community members so their history can be treated with respect and understanding. And regardless if disability is a subject that your organization has the collections to talk about, creating accessible spaces to the best of your ability and with the resources you have should be a #1 priority when you're designing exhibits. Everyone should have the opportunity to learn and engage, and that begins with the spaces that we create and who can actually access them. Thank you.
So bizarrely, I'm kind of covering both elements of railways and oral histories in this, which was not planned, but there we go. So yes, hello, I'm Laura, and I'm going to be talking to you today about Shildon, which is the railway town that is mentioned here. I suspect none of you, or very few of you, will even know about Shildon or where it is, and that's kind of a really important part of why I'm doing this research. So yeah, without further ado, I will crack on. So this is just an indication of kind of what I'm going to cover here and sort of what elements I'm kind of looking at in terms of my research. I'm just coming to the end of my first year of my PhD, so some of this is kind of plans for the future and kind of what I'm looking at doing beyond this point, but it gives you an indication of sort of like where we're going in terms of the research and kind of explaining and exploring sort of why this town is so important. So, situated in the countryside, north of Darlington and southwest of Durham, is the small town of Shildon. Shildon itself has been in existence since the Anglo-Saxon period, with the first recorded mention of the town dating to 821 AD, where the land on which Shildon stands was given to the church. At the beginning of the 1800s, Shildon was still a hamlet with around about 100 inhabitants, predominantly engaged in agriculture and farming. Shildon today now comprises of kind of two distinct developments. So you have the original Shildon, sometimes referred to as Old Shildon, and New Shildon, which came about through the coming of the railways south to the original settlement. Now Shildon itself has a really complex and at times quite conflicting history owing to its post-industrial decline, situated alongside a National Railway Museum. Now, the complexities of this relationship are something I've been sort of dissecting and starting to analyse through my research, intertwined with other organisations and community groups who have strong connections with the town and its industrial past, which I'll briefly explore in this paper. So the shift in Shildon from working the land to working in industry happened through the necessity to transport coal from the Great Northern Coalfields, with the introduction of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Now Shildon itself was situated in a strategic position on the east edge of the southwest Durham coalfield, with abundant reserves of high quality coal. Now this physical position meant that Shildon was at the point where locomotive hauled coal traffic on the Stockton-Darlington Railway was transferred from the incline-worked horse-drawn wagons. It would then be taken via the railways to the ports of County Durham and Teesside. As a result, Shildon is inextricably linked with early railway history, owing its very existence to the coming of the railways. Shildon sprang into new life with the arrival of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825 to serve the numerous early collieries in the vicinity, as well as being the place where locomotion number 1 set off from on the 27th of September 1825, marking the start of the railway. Now, Shildon was the world's first railway town, known as the Cradle of the Railways, as you can see here on this road sign when you enter the town. So, Shildon Wagon Works, which is what kind of is a central part of my research, was built in 1826 to serve the Stockton and Darlington Railway, with the first locomotive built there in 1827, followed by the first railway repair workshop in 1833, to handle heavy repairs following the opening of the railway. Timothy Hackworth was an early railway engineer working at the same time as the Stephensons, who are arguably more famous but probably shouldn't be, and he was a locomotive superintendent of the Stockton and Darlington Railway from 1825 when it opened until 1840. And he constructed his own Soho works in Shildon in 1833, expanding the existing wagon works in the town. From the 1850s onwards, the works would increasingly focus on wagon building and continue to build locomotives until about 1867 and carry out repairs until 1871. At this point, a decision was made to transfer all locomotive building and repairs to Darlington, leaving Shildon to solely concentrate on the repair and construction of railway wagons. As a result, Shildon soon established itself as the major wagon works for the Stockton-Darlington Railway, then later the North Eastern Railway, the London and North Eastern Railway, and finally British Railways. At its height, the Shildon Wagon Works was the largest in Europe, and the huge infrastructure of the sidings that supported the works was the largest in the world. By the 1980s, the wagon works had a capacity to build 1,000 new wagons a year and was widely considered to have some of the most modern and sophisticated machinery in the country, and was the most profitable of the British Rail Engineering Limited works. So this is just to give you an indication of sort of what the site largely began at. So this is in the 1870s. So this is sort of the first kind of 30, 40 years of the site. So the Sebastopol that you can see in the centre, that was the name of the turntable that we used to kind of relocate engines and locomotives as they kind of came into the site. You can kind of see that the line kind of travels sort of east to west. And the works itself is quite is kind of centralised over on the kind of the east side of the site, and there's the town, and it's relatively small. In the kind of top right-hand corner, you can see that there are houses and there are sort of residential developments which haven't at this point kind of massively developed. But if you'll see by the next slide, it has significantly developed. So this was by the 1960s. This is sort of 70 years later. The works itself is incredibly expansive. The large sort of rectangular building in the middle, that was the engine shed, and you can see obviously huge amounts of track and line kind of coming from that. The works itself developed significantly further south of the site, so you can see that by this point you're starting to get kind of cranes and gantries and quite extensive development, and the town itself has grown to kind of accommodate both kind of the workers but also the kind of necessity to have more housing in the town from when it kind of first began. In that way, so you can kind of see the kind of difference that 100 years makes. Next slide, please. So I guess, given all of that information, there's often the question of, well, why did the wagon works close? Around 2,500 people, predominantly men, worked in the wagon works at the start of the 1980s, which was around 1/7 of the population of the town. It was the primary source of employment in Shildon for just over 150 years. However, on the 22nd of April 1982, British Rail announced its intentions to close the works, which began a 2-year fight to save it. Over the course of this 2-year campaign, both Labour leaders during this time, Michael Foot and Neil Kinnock, pledged their support and visited Shildon, and ministers were lobbied at the Houses of Parliament for their support. Ultimately, however, following a 2-year conflict between British Rail and the National Union of Railwaymen, Shildon Wagon Works was closed in June 1984. At the time of closure, nearly 3,000 people worked at the wagon works, and the closure created mass unemployment in Shildon, which was a small, seemingly one-industry town where unemployment was already high. Now, the story told about Shildon, and kind of the one that I've told you so far, often centres on its industrial roots with the wagon works, but there is far more to this narrative that I've uncovered through my research so far. Now, although the Stockton-Darlington Railway and the Wagon Works helped cement Shildon's place within railway history, there were other industries that boomed in the 20th century. Shildon was also a mining town before the Wagon Works was built, like many other towns in the northeast. And although the Wagon Works was the largest employer in the town for decades, other diverse industries thrived in the town, such as a nylon textile manufacturer, a men's clothing factory, a banana processing plant, and a real and faux fur factory called a Straka. Now, the variety of industries working alongside the Wagon Works really does complicate this narrative around Shildon purely being a railway town, and in turn often it gets reduced to that in quite a simplified way in the way that it's described and talked about. Now, my research argues that the intersection of deindustrialisation and the heritageisation of the town's history provides for a more nuanced understanding of Shildon, and one which recontextualises this railway heritage. Now, the most important industry for my research, alongside the Wagon Works, has been the Straka factory, which was set up in Shildon in 1944, and by 1949 employed 200 people. Now, the company began in London in 1898 as Alfred Morris Furs, but was rebranded in 1950 as Straka, making real and faux fur clothing. In September 1970, Straka extended its factory, taking its total workforce to more than 600 people, making it the largest employer in Shildon of women. Now, Straka products were available in the best department stores in the UK, such as Harrods, Selfridges and Phoenix, and they made artificial animal pelts that clothed the Bolshoi Ballet and kitted out the British ski team for the 1980s Winter Olympics. Much like the Wagon Works, however, Straka closed in 1988 after reduced interest globally in real fur and a gradual reduction in its workforce since 1980. It was another huge blow to the town, which had yet to recover from the closure of the Wagon Works 4 years earlier in 1984. Like many industrial towns in Britain at the time, after the Wagon Works and Straka closed, and with little to no investment in the town, there was a significant period of deindustrialisation, largely until the opening of Locomotion, the National Railway Museum at Shildon in 2004. Now, in the late 1990s, the National Railway Museum wanted to make its collections more accessible, especially its rolling stock, which at the time was housed in inadequate storage. Many locations were examined for a museum, but Sedgefield Borough Council offered a brownfield site with a long railway history in Shildon, with connections to the National Rail Network. The site was also once part of the original sidings that I mentioned earlier, that were once the largest in the world, that also served the Wagon Works. It was the perfect site to have a museum. The museum was opened in 2004 by Tony Blair, who at the time was the MP for Sedgefield, and he was also the Prime Minister. It began life as a joint venture between Sedgefield Borough Council and the National Railway Museum, but in 2017 the museum was wholly taken over by the Science Museum Group and is now just known by the name Locomotion. Now, as mentioned by Hope earlier on today, as part of Locomotion and the National Railway Museum's development plans, they have got a multi-million-pound programme of investment, which is known as Vision 2025. Now, this plan will transform Locomotion and the National Railway Museum with new buildings, galleries, visitor attractions, outdoor spaces and vital conservation work. They also plan to enhance their interpretation to better tell the significant story of Shildon and its contribution to the development of the railways worldwide. Now, at Shildon, a collections building is being built currently called New Hall, which will be a brand new 2,000 metre square building, which is currently under construction on the brownfield site to the west of the museum. Now, when this opens, hopefully in November this year, it will house around 45 to 50 additional vehicles, meaning Locomotion will boast the largest collection of historic railway vehicles undercover on one site anywhere in the world, and the largest museum collection of rail vehicles in Europe. So something that has been really important to my research, and something that when I first started this project I didn't really know much about, is the Shildon Railway Institute. And that is, as many things are in Shildon, a kind of a world first. So it was the world's first railway institute, which began in 1833. Timothy Hackworth, the engineer who I mentioned at the beginning, he was the first president of the organisation, which began life as a mechanics institute. Now, it's one of the oldest buildings in the town, dating from before the First World War, but it needs a great deal of financial support to remain an important part of the community. Now, a tentative estimate by the chartered surveying company Edison's suggests that the remedial work will cost an estimated £2.27 million in order to keep the building open and safe for use. Now, in 2022, at the AGM, a motion was tabled and passed that the Institute should investigate changing their organisational structure to reconstitute as a modern form of non-profit organisation, which is known as a community benefit society. Voting took place in June of this year, and the balloted motion was passed. So they're now taking the first steps in registering as a community benefit society in order to help raise much needed funds for the building. Next slide, please. So why is all of this important, and why should we kind of consider it and remember it and commemorate it? Well, there are a lot of anniversaries kind of coming up, as you can see here, both for Locomotion, the Children Railway Institute, and kind of the wider sort of railway heritage, if you will. As there are a lot of developments happening to both improve and sustain the museum at the moment, and also the Institute in the future. Now, in keeping with that, there are several significant anniversaries that tie into children directly related to my research and the legacy of the railways in the town. So this year, the Children Railway Institute celebrates its 190th year. Locomotion, the museum, will celebrate its 20th anniversary in 2024, whilst at the same time the Wagon Works will remember its 40th year since closure. In 2025, the Stockton-Darlington Railway will celebrate its bicentenary. And as the world's first railway town, Shildon will be subject to intense regional, national and international attention over this anniversary period. Now, uniquely for British National Museum, Locomotion sits at the intersection of a local, national and globally significant heritage space, as it's the only national museum in the North East, and many people don't even know it exists. Now, as the international attention kind of turns to Shildon to celebrate and commemorate the engineering and industrial achievements of the Stockton-Darlington Railway, I also want to engage with the legacies of deindustrialisation with the 40th anniversary of the Wagon Works closure, and understand how local voices have, or indeed have not, helped to shape the heritage that Locomotion has represented in Shildon for the past 20 years. So where do we go from here? I hope that this paper has shown briefly that there are lots of complex and conflicting voices in Shildon surrounding its history, its legacy and its kind of wider heritage. These voices are institutional and they're community-based, and their understanding of these histories are shaped by personal experience, the impact of deindustrialisation, political decisions that have been made, cultural developments, particularly in the 21st century, and the need to connect with the rich histories of railways in the town. Now, as part of my research, I'm hoping to isolate some of these voices, giving them the opportunity to tell their stories through the facilitation of oral history interviews that I'm planning to conduct next academic year. Now, these will be with ex-workers from the Wagon Works, other industrial workers from the town, such as those that worked at Ostraka, museum staff, potentially some politicians, community interest groups and volunteer organisations who are actively trying to keep Shildon's history alive. Now, all of these voices are important in understanding how we should remember, celebrate, commemorate and historicise Shildon through the dominant themes that have emerged from my research thus far, addressing deindustrialisation, industrial heritage, collective memory and communities, examined alongside the wider scholarship on museology and the politicisation of heritage in Britain in the late 20th and early 21st century. Of central concern to my research is how museology since the 1990s has increasingly seen museums and heritage sites as social enterprises, working with community members to make institutions more relevant and reflective of the communities they serve. I'm hoping through my research that I can try to understand, or at least see, if this has been happening so far, and if it hasn't, what can be done to change it. Through my ongoing research, I hope to further understand Shildon from cradle to grave and recontextualise this railway town. Thank you.